facts are very hard to get out, but when you start looking into it, you see that actually this is not a fair trial at all, and from start to finish it's been irregular, and it's actually a real stain on the British state and the British justice system that they won't live down. I mean, when Edward Snowden tweeted when Assange was grabbed from the embassy by British police, he said something along the lines of this will define Britain's attitude to the free press for generations, and it's true. I mean, that image will live in infamy. So we need to make sure Britain does not become a party to what would be one of the biggest nails in the coffin of the free press that the world has ever seen, maybe the biggest nail in the coffin. So, and for all the people that are watching who live in Britain, you live in the most important jurisdiction for any kind of activism on this topic, because if he goes to the US, he's got no chance. The real chance he has to avoid and his life be saved and avoid extradition is in the UK. So we really need to focus efforts in the run up to September to expose the irregularities, to expose the bias, and try and get justice.
This is Radio Free Assange.
We're discussing here whether Assange or someone else has done something wrong or not. But what about the war crimes? We are living in a time when our own war crimes are no longer prosecuted. We know that we have conducted aggressive wars. We've hanged people in Nuremberg for this. 175 years for whatever we're accusing Mr. Assange of. This certainly is not violence, certainly is not genocide, certainly is not massacring civilians or torturing anybody. And people for genocide in The Hague, they received 35 or 45 years.
Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange!
You're listening to
Free Assange
Radio.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Basically, I think that Julian Assange is he's a very brave guy. He's a fantastic journalist. He's one of the sort of he's basically being put in prison because he's too good. That's the problem. He's the promise of a free media, which we haven't really had before. We've just had propaganda, and I think that's basically why he's the sort of powerful states such as Britain and the US can't live with him.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free Julian Assange! No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange. Journalism is not a crime. Free Julian Assange.
No extradition!
This is Radio Free Assange.
Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange! Free! Free! Julian Assange!
Free Julian Assange Free Julian Assange.
Good afternoon, Julian Assange. We are here to support you.
Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange!
23 hours a day in a cell in a high maximum security Ecuadorian embassy, and encourage us in our struggle. And in solidarity with Julian Assange.
This is Radio Free Assange.
Les pères fondateurs ne pensaient pas que la tyrannie puisse surgir de l'exécutif, parce qu'ils ne voyaient dans celui-ci rien d'autre que la simple exécution de ce qu'avait décidé le législateur.
In various form, I leave it at that. We know today.
Nous savons aujourd'hui que le plus grand danger de tyrannie vient de l'exécutif. Mais si nous prenons à la lettre l'esprit de la Constitution, que pensaient les pères fondateurs? Ils pensaient s'être libérés d'abord de la domination de la majorité. C'est pourquoi ce serait une grave erreur de penser que ce que nous avons est une démocratie. Ce que nous avons ici, c'est un système républicain. Les pères fondateurs s'attachaient surtout à préserver les droits des minorités parce qu'ils estimaient que dans un corps politique sain, il doit y avoir une pluralité d'opinions. Ce que les Français appellent l'union sacrée était précisément pour eux ce dont il ne fallait pas. Ce serait déjà une sorte de tyrannie et le tyran pourrait très bien être une majorité.
This is Radio Free Assange.
No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition! There's only one decision! No extradition! There's only one decision!
We fell in love, and this is a person that I knew well by then, the person I know the most in this world. He's extraordinary. He's generous and he's very tender and loving. Forming a family was a deliberate decision to kind of break down those walls around him and see life, imagine a life beyond that prison. And so, while for many people it would seem insane to start a family in that context, for us it was the same thing to do. It was what keeps things real. And it does. It grounds me. And when Julian sees the children, it gives him a lot of peace and nurture. I compare it to being in a war zone, constant relentless attacks. That there are operations underway, and it's not some crazed conspiracy theory. It's part of the reality of the context in which everything to do with Julian exists. Just like in war, people fall in love and decide to live their lives in an act of rebellion, I think. Falling in love is kind of an act of rebellion in a context where there's a lot of attempts to destroy your life and your reason for doing what you're doing. older one is actually very much like Julian. He looks a lot like.
Which one do you want me to look at? This one? Either? Both? Okay. 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 I'm Rebecca Vincent, the Director of International Campaigns for Reporters Without Borders, outside the Old Bailey after day 11 of Julian Assange's US extradition hearing. Today we heard from Professor Koppelman, a neuropsychiatrist who spoke about Mr. Assange's state of mind, his history of mental health issues, painted a very clear picture of a vulnerable individual who suffers from depression, who has intense suicidal thoughts, and he made it very clear that he believes Mr. Assange is at risk. He said clearly that if Mr. Assange is extradited to the US, he believes that he will find a way to commit suicide. So he did not mince words in that regard. What we heard from the prosecution in cross-examining Professor Koppelman was really I would categorize it as a willful misinterpretation of mental health issues and a lack of understanding, possibly intentionally as well, about neurodiversity, because Mr. Assange also has traits of Asperger's. The line of questioning at times tried to undermine the credibility of Professor Koppelman. And at one humorous point, Professor Koppelman actually said, you know, I am a psychiatrist, you are a lawyer, and accused Mr. Lewis for the prosecution of attempting to make psychiatric diagnoses. But Professor Koppelman in the end came off as very credible and made it clear that Mr. Assange is at tremendous risk. So I also want to be clear that as long as Mr. Assange is in the UK, we as a country here bear responsibility for his conditions. I think what we heard today paints a picture of again, this vulnerability of a clear humanitarian need for his release. And Reporters Without Borders stands our ground that we believe he should be released on substance as well. The charges against him should be dropped. But that aside, there are also compelling humanitarian reasons that he should not be detained. So regardless of what the US is going after him for, the UK does bear responsibility now for his conditions in Belmarsh prison and his well-being. And if we hand him over to the United States, as a country, the UK government will bear responsibility for what happens to him next there as well. So loud.
We've also heard that the WikiLeaks founder has given a confession to a priest. You know, who began drafting farewell letters to the family and friends, you know, in the will. Do you know anything about that? Can you come in through that for us, please?
I can only on what we heard today, really, in that regard. So Professor Koppelman did speak about Mr. Assange preparing and planning for suicide, spoke about his frequent calls to the Samaritans. So that, again, on top of the history of mental health issues and particularly these periods of depression that Professor Koppelman gave very specific evidence to, that paints a very worrying picture indeed. So the prosecution tried to undermine that, tried to portray it as something that Mr. Assange could fake or could exaggerate at the very least. And Professor Koppelman was very clear that in his position going in to consult with anybody in prison, it has to be approached from the perspective of, you know, they could be trying to exaggerate. So he bore that in mind in his interactions with Mr. Assange, and it is his professional expert opinion that these things are true, that it is not an exaggeration, that Mr. Assange suffers from depression, suffers from these other issues that were detailed today, and that should be taken very seriously indeed from a neuropsychiatrist.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.